Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar there attacked while speaking at a town hall event in Minneapolis Tuesday night. In the video, seconds after Omar calls on DHS Secretary Kristi Noem to resign, a man approaches her, sprays an unknown liquid on her with a syringe.
Kristi Noem must resign or face impeachment. I don't know.
CNN's Sarah Seidner was at that town hall. She saw all this happen. Sarah, what did it look like from your perspective?
Look, there was a lot of fear initially. People couldn't figure out what happened. He was towards the very front of all of the rows of people who had come to the town hall, which, by the way, she has monthly. We were in North Minneapolis. She had it at the Urban League. And as soon as he sort of jumped up and came towards her, it was interesting to note that as he went around the side, he had what looked like a syringe in his hand, some sort of liquid he sprayed out of it, and you could immediately smell it. It smelled kind of like vinegar, a vinegary substance. We still don't know exactly what was in that syringe. An investigation we now know is underway. But after he did that, Ilhan Omar herself, the congresswoman, went for him. She cocked her arm back, and it looked like she was going to lunge toward him. But before she had a chance to do that, her own security detail jumping on him, taking him to the ground, eventually wrestling his arms behind his back and taking him out of the vicinity so that he could be brought in by police. Ilhan Omar herself looked over. They were telling her security detail. I watched them talking to her, saying, "We need you to stop. We are concerned about what this is. We don't want you to continue." She says, "No, I'm going to continue. I will not let anyone intimidate me." And she stood in front of the crowd that was still there, who clapped for her as she continued talking about the situation here when it comes to immigration. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of concern and there was fear among her staff about whether or not she was going to be okay. Alex?
Well, and then right after that, she spoke exclusively with you, Sarah. What'd she say?
Yeah, I just happened to pull my cell phone out after a photographer, Jerry Simonson, was focused on the person who was wrestled to the ground and being taken out. And I asked her simply if she was okay, and here's how she responded. Representative Omar, are you okay?
You know, I'm going to go figure if I am, but I feel okay. I feel that it is important for people, whether they are in elected office or not, to allow these people to intimidate us, to make us not fight for our constituents and for the country we love. And as I said, you know, I've survived war, and I'm definitely going to survive intimidation and whatever these people think they can throw at me, because I'm built that way.
Thank you. I'm built that way. Her last words there as she went to the back where she eventually began getting checked by medical staff. But yeah, this was a moment that did freak everyone out in the room, considering that just like many other members of Congress, Ilhan Omar has gotten threats. She's gotten death threats. But her staff tells me this is the first time that she's ever faced any kind of attack inside her own town halls, which she has regularly. Like I said, once a month here. And we are standing here in North Minneapolis, where her constituents came to listen to what she had to say, and she was very pointed about what she feels is going on in her own community, and very clear that she wants ICE out, she wants Kristi Noem out, and she wants ICE to leave this community because she says it is just breaking her community apart.
There were some Republicans who were quick to condemn the attack. Mike Lawler called it unacceptable. Mark Alford said while he disagrees with Omar, quote, these disagreements should never result in assault. And Nancy Mace says she was deeply disturbed. One Republican who did not seem worried about it, President Trump. Speaking to ABC News, he suggested without evidence that the attack was somehow staged, saying, quote, I think she's a fraud. I really don't think about that. She probably had herself sprayed knowing her. The same president who just hours before had said this about Minneapolis.
We have Tom Homan there now. We put him in there. He's great. And they met with the governor, the mayor, everybody else, and we're going to de-escalate a little bit.
Joining me now in the group chat, Zach Wolf, CNN senior politics writer, Kristen Soltis Anderson, CNN political commentator and Republican pollster, and Antoine Seawright, Democratic strategist. Antoine, can I actually start with you? I don't know if you heard in your group chats or people in Democratic circles started talking about this last night.
Well, I did. America's not like this because Donald Trump is the president. Donald Trump is the president because America's like this. And believe it or not, there's some sick, deranged people out there who are celebrating online when members of Congress are attacked, when they're threatened, particularly visible figures like Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others. And I think that we, as Americans, have to step back, but I also think leaders, starting at the presidency level, should always condemn these type things because it cannot be good for them and not good for me. When the president was under attack, Americans came together to condemn it, and so the president has to tone down the rhetoric because we've seen January 6th is a direct result. When his language goes out, people respond to it.
Yes, although I think the argument was the attack on him and Butler was the result of rhetoric against him, how people had talked about him. Hold on, I want to play for you something because Trump has, of course, dismissed the attack on Omar. She's a longtime sort of what's the word, villain, social media villain on the right. Here is what he had to say yesterday, and then I'm also going to take you back to 2019.
They have to show that they can love our country. They have to be proud. Not like Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage.
Omar has a history of launching vicious anti-Semitic screeds.
I feel like usually on a panel there's someone who says people love Trump for his punchy language, and are people, I think, is the public starting maybe a bit to sour as they see attack after attack and these sort of incidents on lawmakers?
I mean, I think in some ways it's a numbness rather than a cheering for it or a souring on it. It's just a this is just like the toxic soup in which we live now. I think it's horrible. I'm glad that some Republicans came out and condemned it. I wish all of them would. Just like I thought it was reprehensible that the internet fever swamps had cooked up that there was some conspiracy theory when Donald Trump was shot in Butler. I think it's terrible that fever swamps and the president are cooking up conspiracy theories around this. I hope this man is investigated. I hope they throw the book at him. Because when we have a culture where people who run for public office and are in the public eye are under threats of violence, and this, again, did start with Trump.
But isn't that a moment precisely when Trump should not say something like, hey, she probably faked it? I mean, it's been hours, not even.
100%.
Okay, this brings me to the other thing, who they can feel like they can speak ill about and the limits of that. They came up against a hard limit with Alex Preddy, right, calling him a domestic terrorist after he died at the hands of ICE. Here is the president on Tuesday. You're going to hear a very different tone than what we heard from the administration over the weekend.
Do you agree with the assessment from some of your own officials that Alex Preddy is a domestic terrorist or an assassin?
Well, I haven't heard that, but certainly he shouldn't have been carrying a gun. But hey, look, bottom line, everybody in this room, we view that as a very unfortunate incident, okay? Right. Everyone, unless you're a stupid person.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller, the president's powerful advisor, are taking heat over the deadly shooting of Alex Preddy and their statements after it. Miller described Preddy as a would-be assassin. Noem described him as a domestic terrorist. The videos clearly refuted those claims, and now Noem is facing growing bipartisan calls to resign. And Miller, in a rare retreat, is acknowledging agents may have breached protocol that he set or the White House set before the shooting. With us now, CNN's Betsy Klein and Jeff Zeleny. And first, I just want to hold up a flow chart, friend, of my understanding of the blame game here. There you can see, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is blaming Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller seems to be blaming Customs and Border Protection. Betsy, you're at the White House. Do I have that flow chart correct?
I think that's about an accurate assessment, John. And I just want to point to you to this very remarkable statement to our colleague Kristen Holmes from Stephen Miller yesterday. As you said, in the immediate aftermath of federal agents' killing of Alex Preddy on Saturday, we heard Stephen Miller go to social media almost immediately. He referred to Preddy as, quote, a domestic terrorist, also a would-be assassin. And you can believe that he was behind a lot of the messaging that was coming from this White House. But then last night, in this statement to our colleague Kristen Holmes, he says, quote, the White House had provided clear guidance to DHS that the extra personnel that had been sent to Minnesota for force protection should be used for conducting fugitive operations to create a physical barrier between the arrest teams and the disruptors. He goes on to say, we are evaluating why the CBP team may not have been following that protocol. He also says that some of the original statements that were coming from the Department of Homeland Security were, quote, based on reports from CBP on the ground. So clearly shifting blame there and notably not disputing that he was involved in those statements.
But not apologizing for them either, correct, Betsy?
Absolutely right.
Okay, and that's important because he said those things. He's blaming now CBP for giving him the information that led to those statements, but he is not apologizing. Jeff, bigger picture here, when you take a step back, this is very unusual from this Trump administration, or any Trump administration for that matter. They have really conducted now about 3 retreats in the last week, by my count. First on Greenland, first the idea no military action, definitely going to own it now. Maybe not so much. The president had to backtrack on saying NATO troops weren't on the front lines in Afghanistan, and now clearly backing off a little bit in Minneapolis. That's a lot different than we've seen before from this administration, Jeff.
John, it absolutely is. It's not only unusual, it just hasn't happened, particularly on immigration. Look, this was intended to be a strength for President Trump. It always has been. It's one of the things that helped get him elected in the first place back in 2016 and certainly reelected in 2024. Now immigration is viewed by Republicans as a weakness for this administration. That explains the flowchart that you were pointing out earlier. Stephen Miller isn't doing this simply because he's suddenly had a change of heart. He's doing this because even a few Republicans, a small but growing number of Republicans, are beginning to confront and challenge and question this administration. It is all coming, of course, as the very mission in Minnesota is being reviewed. And it's a funding review from ICE, of course. It could lead to a government shutdown at the end of the week. We shall see. But Stephen Miller knows the president is unhappy about this. That's why he is sort of backpedaling here. But the bigger picture, it's not just optics here. Is policy actually going to change? And that is very much unclear. One huge difference from this administration versus the first Trump administration, he's very reluctant to fire anyone. In the first administration, people were being fired all the time, week by week. That has not happened. So I do not expect any firings here. But this is a dramatic change of a position here. And keep your eye on Stephen Miller. He's viewed as a liability in some circles here. He's very close to the president. I don't expect him to go anywhere. But that statement that Betsy was reading is extraordinary because we have never seen a retreat like that from him.
Yeah, and Betsy, just, I'll hold up the flowchart once again since Jeff just celebrated it here. Where's the president in this flowchart? Who exactly does the president blame among these 3 choices?
Well, I think the president's message here is that he's trying to de-escalate. He is trying to, we've seen him even talk to Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Jacob Fry in the aftermath. And the president now is essentially saying that those calls are cordial and constructive. But when we ask if this is a substantive or a symbolic change, the White House is still actively blaming Democrats. We heard from Caroline Leavitt saying that this is a deliberate and hostile resistance by Democrat officials, blaming the Preti killing on Democrats. But the question is going to be, what is the change on the ground in Minneapolis here? And President Trump is appearing to indicate that there might be some more substantive changes. We'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, based on how Tom Homan has described the conversations with Tim Walz and the mayor there, and they both have described it, there is a bit of substantive difference there, merely in the dialogue. And very quickly, Jeff, while I still have you here, Republicans on Capitol Hill, how far do you think they're willing to take their criticism?
Well, we will see. I mean, it's a growing number, but it's still a very small number of people. But I think the Senate Majority Leader John Thune was interesting yesterday. He called this an inflection point. So everyone is calling for an investigation and more oversight into ICE. Again, that is not something we saw after the Renee Good shooting. So this is a different moment. There is no doubt about it. But again, to Betsy's point, will policies change on the ground? Again, what was a strength for the administration is now a political weakness.
A lot of fingers being pointed over the Trump administration's false claim that Alex Preti, the man fatally shot in Minneapolis, was out to massacre federal agents, an accusation just not supported by the video we've all seen. Multiple sources suggested to Axios that the language came from the president's hardline advisor, Stephen Miller, with one source saying, quote, Miller gun and knew what the narrative would be. Preti came to massacre cops. Miller, for his part, said, quote, any early comments made were based on information sent to the White House through Customs and Border Protection. With us now is Mark Caputo, the senior politics reporter for Axios, who really broke this story yesterday. Mark, as always, I'm really excited to talk to you since you were out so far in front of the story. I put together a little flow chart based on your reporting here of who is being blamed and how inside the White House and inside the administration. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is blaming Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller appears to be blaming Customs and Border Protection. Do I have that correct?
I mean, generally, what I do know is that Noem is feeling the heat, obviously on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, and she's told people, and I'm told she also told the president, look, everything I've said is because of what I've been told to say and do by the president and Stephen Miller. And as you pointed out, Miller is saying, That statement that was released came because of on-the-ground reports from CBP. And specifically what you're hearing more people in the White House start to say is the bad guy in all of this, and I'm putting bad guy in air quotes, is Greg Bovino, who was the commander, the cowboy, in the words of one person, who was in charge of this, let's call it a shambolic operation that resulted in the deaths of 2 people and the shooting of a total of 3 in a month.
Yeah, there are 2 separate things I think we should point out here that Miller now seems to be saying to you and others. Number one, that CBP, that the officers on the ground broke some kind of protocol, some kind of instructions they'd been given by the White House about how they were supposed to behave, actually enforce the law. But also Miller is saying that he was told perhaps misleading stuff by CBP. Those are 2 things, but are those both directionally what Stephen Miller is saying now?
Yeah, that's correct. According to the White House, according to Miller, there is a protocol that they had developed where these teams, these squads that would go on these immigration raids or to execute these warrants or find, in their words, these criminal aliens, would be divided in 2. One group would do crowd control to stop what they called the disruptors, and the other would go and do the arrests. And according to them, on this fateful day, on Saturday, that just sort of devolved into chaos, and none of that took place. Now, obviously, in the background of this, there have been other videos, other cases of pretty egregious policing that had happened under Bovino. Specifically, there was the young man at Target, the Target worker who was pushing around grocery store carts, got in some sort of jawboning incident with these agents. They tackled him, they kind of beat him, they shoved him in a van, and they dropped him off nearby. Stuff like that did start to really rankle at the president, and finally the president made his change on Monday.
Yeah, I was going to say, so based on your reporting, if we have this chart of the blame game, where does the president fit here? As far as you can tell, who is the president blaming for all this?
He's not really blaming anyone. It's just one of those sort of, hey, things sort of happen and let's move on. One of the things the president doesn't want to do is communicate a weakness that he's backing off. And in that, under that umbrella, is the idea that he needs to make a change. So let's just be very clear. Kristi Noem, from all of the information we're getting and from all the observations that we've made collectively as the news media and those of us who cover the White House specifically, Kristi Noem is staying, and so is Stephen Miller, his longest-serving political advisor from Trump 1, architect of the immigration plan, a guy with encyclopedic knowledge of immigration law, who really sort of represents a lot of the hardline policies that Trump at heart really does enjoy.
And then just very quickly, any bit of reporting that you've done that indicates that Noem or Miller or anyone might apologize for the statements that they made just after this incident happened on Saturday?
I have gotten no indication of that. We've asked if, hey, do you want to issue at least some sort of correcting information? And so far, the answer to that has been no.
Mark Caputo, as I said, great reporting on this. You were out in front with this yesterday. Really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
My colleagues here at MS Now and I have obtained the first official timeline of this incident, which undercuts some of the statements made by Trump administration officials in the immediate aftermath of the killing. This is a preliminary review from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and it makes no mention of Preddy brandishing a weapon or intending to do maximum damage and kill law enforcement. That's notable because that's what Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and other officials claimed. This report, which was sent to lawmakers on the Hill yesterday afternoon, also revealed that 2 federal agents filed at Preddy after he resisted arrest, they say. Questions remain about what exactly led agents to fire those fatal shots. And then when it comes to the investigation, sources tell MS Now that the Justice Department has decided there will be no civil rights probe into the shooting. Instead, a Customs and Border Protection office will investigate their own officers. And another DHS unit, which normally focuses on human trafficking and national security threats, will look into whether Preddy broke any laws. Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension says it's separately investigating the shooting, but has not been given access to any evidence or information from federal agencies. Makes doing an investigation really hard. Want to bring in now live from the ground in Minneapolis, MS Now reporter Jillian Frankel. Jillian, you've been following this closely. I know you're talking to people on the ground. What is the reaction you're hearing to the Department of Justice not opening a criminal rights probe into this shooting? And what does that mean then for the investigation moving forward? Because we know that Minnesota and their local officials are trying to do their own investigations there. But again, access to information or a lack of it makes it really hard.
That's exactly right, Allie. I cannot stress enough how unusually this entire investigation is being handled here. We know no civil rights probe in this instance. There also wasn't one in the shooting death of Renee Good. And just to back up a little more broadly here, the way that this would typically unfold, we would see the FBI investigate this incident in conjunction with state officials, which, as you mentioned here, is the BCA in Minnesota, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They are still trying to do this investigation, but it's now being led federally by the Department Department of Homeland Security, and more specifically, the unit is HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, which hasn't turned over any evidence over to the BCA. They are still trying to pursue this. They've been on the ground where Alex Preddy was shot and killed on the streets here in Minneapolis, but they're moving forward without any of that federal help here. And as I've spoken with the Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty before this shooting took place, but after the shooting of Renee Good, she said what Minnesotans really want is transparency in investigations like this. Allie?
Well, we are getting a sense of some transparency because yesterday we were able to obtain the first most extensive, I would say, remarks from CBP about what happened in this incident. And there are some really clear contradictions in here. Everything from at what point was the gun actually seen that was supposedly with Preddy? At what point was it recovered? What caused agents to fire those shots in the first place? All of those are really sticky details, but also very much contradictory in this CBP report that we obtained yesterday from what we heard initially from top DHS officials, right? So can we square any of those circles at this point?
That's tough, Allie. Yeah, as you mentioned, and I should just back up here, the Department of Homeland Security came out immediately after this shooting over the weekend, way before an investigation could thoroughly take place, claiming that he had brandished this weapon, that he showed up that day to cause harm to law enforcement. That now is contradicting the video evidence that we've seen from multiple angles at the scene of this incident. And yeah, in this minute-by-minute timeline that you were able to obtain, it didn't appear that he was brandishing this weapon. What's not exactly clear is at what point these agents were able to remove the weapon here. But the trust in federal officials, in law enforcement to be able to conduct an investigation like this is already so tenuous here on the ground in Minneapolis. So these details and when these federal officials come out and make these claims is really critical here.
Yeah, it's really critical. I'm always a fan of when we see government agencies writing something down. It's a lot harder to change something that is actually in print. But at the same time, this is an instance where we can see what happened with our own eyes. And we've seen it for days now, despite the narratives that this administration has tried to put out. MS Now reporter Jillian Frankel live with us from Minneapolis. Thank you for coming on. And President Trump spoke to Fox News yesterday about sending border czar Tom Homan now to Minnesota, as well as the deaths of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. He also talked about his call with Governor Tim Walz. Watch.
Well, I think the whole thing is terrible. I don't like the fact that he was carrying a gun that was fully loaded and he had 2 magazines with him, and it's pretty unusual. But nobody knows when they saw the gun, how they saw the gun, everything else. Bottom line, it was terrible. Both of them were terrible. The other was terrible, too. And I'm not sure about his parents, but I know her parents were big Trump fans. Makes me feel bad anyway. But, I mean, I guess you could say even worse. They were tremendous Trump people, Trump fans. And, you know, the daughter was, she was, I don't know if you could say radicalized, maybe not. I don't know. But I hate to see it. I hate to see that.
The message is out that Tom Homan is in.
Yeah.
Commander Bovino is supposedly leaving Minneapolis along with some CBP agents. Is this a pullback?
I don't think it's a pullback. It's a little bit of a change. Everybody in this room that has a business, you know, you make little changes. You know, Bovino is very good, but he's a pretty out there kind of a guy. And in some cases, that's good. Maybe it wasn't good here. But you have to understand, when I watch some of the people that I've been watching over the last few weeks, these are paid insurrectionists. These are paid agitators. These people aren't normal, like, OG, that, you know, they're incensed about anything. How do you get incensed when you go into a state and you're taking criminals out? You're taking monsters out, murderers. It couldn't have been a nicer conversation. And in fact, I said to my people, I said, it's hard to believe that's the same guy I watch on television, or I watch in a debate not doing so well, or because we had a very reasonable conversation, very good conversation. If you believe the conversation, he'd like to get this thing over with.
There's so much to begin to pick apart from that interview, from a Republican president saying that he doesn't like that someone was carrying a gun in a concealed carry state with a permit. That's got people who are Second Amendment proponents confused, outraged. Might be why some Republicans are speaking negatively about this moment. Also, the use of the word insurrectionist from a president who immediately pardoned January 6th insurrectionists on his first day in office. We're going to dig into more of it. But it all comes as a growing number of Democrats and Republicans are now calling on Kristi Noem to resign as head of Homeland Security. Senators Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Tom Tillis of North Carolina are the first Republican members of Congress to publicly call on Noem to step down. Tillis notably is not seeking another term. He said Noem's actions reflected, quote, amateurish assistant manager sort of thought processes, and called her actions, quote, unacceptable for someone in a cabinet level position. Watch.
I think that what she's done in Minnesota should be disqualifying. She should be out of the job.
So as of this morning, President Trump is standing by Noam, continuing to defend her, including during an interview with Fox News last night.
Do you still have confidence in DHS Secretary Kristi Noem? You brought up the success at the border.
Look,
you do.
She was there with the border. Who closed up the border? She did, with Tom Homan, with the whole group. I mean, they closed up the border. The border is a tremendous success, one of the most secure borders in the entire world.
Want to bring in Playbook reporter at Politico, Ali Bianco. My fellow Ali, there's so much for us to dig into here. I mean, again, the Second Amendment concerns, it does sort of feel when you listen to some Republicans in this administration and their initial reaction here, like up is down. I mean, reading some of the statements from the NRA and other gun groups, it's been a really interesting dynamic. But even just putting that aside, what does it look like inside the White House right now? What are your sources telling you about a potential changing of the guard? Is that a step back, or is it just a changing of who's on the ground in Minnesota and they're putting Tom Homan in because at least he has a background and decades of history within this organization?
Well, there's really two messages that we're hearing right now. I think what my colleagues are reporting and, you know, the people in the White House that they're speaking to are standing by Noam. I mean, we saw it with Trump on this clip. We're seeing it from some of the top officials coming out of the White House who publicly are saying, you know, Noam is staying where she is. This is not an indictment on her, you know, role and leading the Department of Homeland Security. They're being very clear that they believe that this is not something that's going to be sort of a mark on her character or her ability to lead. But privately, what a lot of people close to the White House are telling my colleagues is that, you know, the actions of, you know, sending Tom Homan into Minnesota maybe speak louder than the words of, you know, saying that Noam is still very much in her same power. Yeah. I think this also comes, as my colleagues have reported, that Noam has been on thin ice for a while. Yes. There's been some ongoing concerns about her leadership, everything from the handling of FEMA during disaster response to, you know, some of the more flashy moments that she's had that have definitely drawn a little bit of raised eyebrows from, you know, the GOP caucus in terms of what she's doing on immigration.
I mean, me and my colleagues reported at the end of the year that there was a widespread belief inside of DHS that she was going to be out in January at some point, as early as the first of the year. Obviously, that's not where we are right now, but you're 100% right to point out that internally in the White House, she's been skating on thin ice. I will say now, when you add in the rebukes from Republicans on the Hill, who this is as far as they've gone. And yesterday on Morning Joe, I was kind of skeptical about when they were calling for an investigation. That meant the bar was on the floor because obviously we should be investigating these things. But does it matter that people like Tom Tillis and Lisa Murkowski are coming out and saying she needs to step down at the same time as House Democrats are saying she needs to be fired and step down or we'll impeach her or try because they don't have the numbers?
It's going to create an interesting dynamic for the White House because what we're seeing in the reports is if Trump removes Noam right now, then that's, you know, him saying, oh, we're admitting that this was a problem. You know, all of the reporting bears out that Trump is not going to do that. He's not going to immediately do something that is going to give Democrats a win or something to kind of hang on to from this entire crisis. Instead, what's going on is we see the Trump administration, you know, ramping up Tom Homan, ramping up their border czar. We saw him in the clip, you know, echoing a lot of what Republicans are saying right now, which is like, you can't look at this in a vacuum. You have to look at the border. You have to look at law enforcement. You have to look at, you know, historic low levels of border crossings. You know, they're trying to put all of this in a bigger context. But what we're concretely seeing on the ground is, you know, Trump coming after Bovino, you know, who is one of the main chiefs at Border Patrol. Correct. And we're seeing Homan being the liaison with Governor Tim Walz and with Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey.
Yeah, and if you want to do the Trump worldology on this, too, Homan is at cross purposes with people like Noam and Lewandowski, reportedly, who are more allied with Bovino. And so, again, if you're watching rising and falling fortunes in Trump world, which is typically how people keep their jobs, that's also pretty important to the way that this might move forward.
Foreign Relations, Judiciary, and Appropriation Committees. And, of course, he's joining us this morning to talk about Marco Rubio on Capitol Hill starting at 10 a.m. Eastern. But before we get to that, Senator, I'm curious if you think the Trump administration is doing enough to restore order, peace to the streets of Minneapolis and other places, and accountability pertaining to ICE. And if not, can Democrats and any Republicans you can bring along with you do anything about it?
Thanks, Mika. No, President Trump and his administration are not doing enough to lower the temperature and to address the tragic killing of Alex Pretty and of Renee Good, and to insist on the sort of transparency and accountability that law enforcement lives with and works with around our country every day. 20 years ago, I was a county executive responsible for the second largest law enforcement agency in my state. And those of us who have worked closely with law enforcement understand that when we give a badge and a gun and swear in police officers, we are asking them to undertake an incredibly difficult and important mission to keep the peace and to protect and serve their communities. What's happened in Minneapolis breaks that trust with the community, and the lack of any involvement by the Minneapolis or Minnesota police in the investigation of these shootings, the lack of a clear, prompt, and transparent investigation, something called for by both Democrats and Republicans here in the Senate, is a critical first step. So if President Trump wants to make any difference here, he needs to withdraw ICE and CBP from Minneapolis. He needs to instigate, he needs to launch a clear and transparent investigation of the sort that happens week in and week out around the country. And we need to move forward with body-worn cameras and a clear protocol for how they're going to be used, with the end of masked agents who are nameless and faceless, and with the end of the assertion of the use of an administrative warrant to get into Americans' homes. All of these are critical steps that we've been discussing here in the Senate. We face a key vote tomorrow on whether or not we're going to go ahead with appropriations. I'm going to vote against DHS appropriations unless and until we have actions like this in law that we can deliver to the American people to show there is going to be accountability and transparency after these horrific killings in Minneapolis.
So, as Jonathan Lemire, correct me if I'm wrong, but Senator, we don't know the ICE agents who, I guess there's two now, who shot up Alex Preddy. We don't know who they are. We don't know, are they still on the job? Have they been removed from the state? There's a lot of questions about transparency here.
That's right.
Evidence has been taken from the state, or at least from state officials. You're right about body cam video. I'm hearing conflicting reports on that. And I'm just wondering, what would you like, what would be helpful, what would be constructive for Tom Homan to do immediately? I'm going to give you, like, ABCD choice, like an SAT test. Sure. Put the ICE agents on administrative leave.
Yes.
Give evidence back to the state. Body cams on all ICE agents. And how about a complete and thorough review of how these ICE agents are being trained? Because from the videos that we get from across the country, from reports from local organizations, people who just want to protect their neighbors, and local governors, because of course blue states and red states are being treated differently here. But what we're hearing is a lot of laws are being broken in the process of trying to round out undocumented immigrants, which of course they want to call criminal illegal aliens. And it seems to me that it's possible these guys are so untrained that they have no idea what they're doing. They're bumping into each other. And in a scrum like this over Alex Preddy that we're showing right now, NYPD, Minneapolis PD would have had the person down and de-escalated in 3 seconds or less with no one hurt. This doesn't have to happen. There are procedure issues here. Homan has great experience. He worked for Obama. He has the capacity. I know he has put on a different front for this administration, but he has the capacity to know and teach proper procedure. Where is it?
Correct. Correct. So accountability here and moving forward is going to require getting back into a relationship with community of trust, involving career professional law enforcement officials from Minnesota who understand how to secure a crime scene, how to do an officer-involved shooting investigation transparently and appropriately. Look, Mika, more foundationally, we have First Amendment, Second Amendment, and Fourth Amendment violations happening here. We've got agents claiming that with an administrative warrant, they can get into Americans' homes. That violates the Fourth Amendment. We've got our president saying things that essentially amount to Alex Preddy deserved it because he was carrying a gun he had a permit to carry. This is a striking change from the strong defense of Second Amendment rights we typically hear from Republicans. And Alex Preddy was there as a peaceful protester. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He had a camera. He was recording what ICE and CBP agents were doing. And his last act was to help a woman who'd been shoved to the ground by an overly aggressive officer. As you remark, and as I agree, they are not adequately trained in how to respond to protests and in how to execute warrants safely and securely in a way that's appropriate to this setting. First, they need to withdraw from Minneapolis. Second, they need new and clear procedures. And then third, we need confidence in the leadership of DHS. I don't now. Kristi Noem should resign or be fired, and there needs to be a new chain of command for whatever remains of our customs and immigration enforcement within the United States.
And a pair of Republican senators joined your call for Noem to step aside. Senator Coons, let's now turn to foreign affairs and that testimony from Secretary of State Rubio to your committee. in about 45 or so minutes' time. I guess an advance copy of his prepared remarks have been released, or at least obtained, and in it, Rubio, on the subject of Venezuela, has says that the Trump administration will take additional military action if the new government there in Venezuela doesn't cooperate with U.S. goals. Now, it's not really a new government. It's simply Maduro's second in command. But let's get your response to that, the warning from the Secretary of State. And what other questions do you want to hear answered today about Venezuela?
Look, my former colleague on the Foreign Relations Committee, now Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, needs to consult more closely and regularly with Congress. These threats to use force against Venezuela by the administration, it's unclear where they're driving and what their goals are. They did not come clean with us about their intention to rendition Maduro out of Venezuela using military force. This wasn't a police action. It was a military action in which nearly 100 Cubans and Venezuelans were killed. I am grateful that no American soldiers were killed in this action. I do not mourn Maduro's removal from power. He was a horrible dictator. But if Secretary Rubio and our president are going to carry out threats and threats of force against Iran, against Nigeria, against Greenland and Denmark, against Venezuela, we need to be more closely consulted, and Congress has a critical role. This is part of what we are here for in the Constitution.
The government appears to be heading, though, for a partial shutdown by the end of the week, as a growing number of Senate Democrats say they will oppose legislation that includes funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Joining us now, Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland. She's also a former prosecutor and says she's voting no on the DHS funding bill. Good to have you on the show. Do you want to get to your legal expertise on some of these issues in just a moment? But first, voting no on this bill, what does it do necessarily? Doesn't DHS, isn't it awash in cash for quite some time right now?
Oh, you're absolutely right. It is. It is the case that these Republicans have already superfunded DHS at a tune of $75 billion. And what we know now is that our country is not only in a moral crisis, but we have a double crisis going. There is an affordability crisis that is happening, but we're also seeing a horrific accountability crisis that is happening at the same time. So, no, not another penny for this murderous organization to move forward. And what we have seen is that Americans are asking the question, why can't I afford health care? And if you're wondering that, we only have to turn on the television now to see how our dollars have been misappropriated to fund this organization that is ill-trained and that is terrorizing and killing Americans on American streets. It's horrific what we've seen. And so not another penny, but you're right, we should level set. $75 billion already has been appropriated and has been passed by these Republicans in that big, beautiful bill. And so, but why should we put another penny toward this organization?
Okay, and the effort not to fund it in the future is one, but what are other options that those who might be very concerned about what is happening here, are there any other legal or options that Congress can take to demand accountability from the top down on these ICE operations, which I know were focused on the two killings of American citizens that even some reports have, and autopsy reports have led to conclusions that these killings were at the hands of ICE and at the blame of ICE.
Well, you know what?
Still a lot more to learn because we don't
easy.
have state investigations into them.
Well, you know what? We don't have the state investigation yet, but we have our eyes. All of us watched clearly this man, Alex Pretty, who was executed on the street in our country. We watched also Nicole Good. And you're asking, what can we do? It's so simple. The Republicans who empowered these people, the ones who voted for Kristi Noem and voted for this kind of leadership, have an obligation to our country to stand up now and to hold them accountable. It's a very simple thing. It is not complicated, but these Republicans owe it to the American people right now to speak out, to hold this administration accountable for the killing of Americans on American streets. And it is not a complicated thing, and it ought to be happening as we speak. The accountability crisis is going to send our country continuing on this downward spiral. You know what? This president says he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. There's no peace in America right now. No peace. Don't we deserve to have peace in our country? And we can do that if my Republican colleagues stand up and say no more, no more.
Senator, that's what I was going to ask you. Good morning. One of the stories of the Trump years has been what Republicans say in public about Donald Trump versus what they say in private. And I'm curious, talking to some of your Republican colleagues, We've seen a small handful in the last couple of days, Senator Murkowski, Senator Tillis, who is retiring, speaking out and saying Kristi Noem should resign, which you've been calling for here as well. But is there a sense, even if it's just in your private conversations among Republicans, that this is not what their constituents voted for? Even as the Wall Street Journal writes this morning, Mr. President, take the victory that the border is secure and walk away from these scenes that we're seeing in the streets. Are you hearing any of that from your colleagues?
Well, I don't know that I am, but I can tell you that any conscientious person watching this unfold knows that it's untenable and that it cannot last. Furthermore, what we're seeing is the standards the DHS has for these officers. Every law enforcement officer in America should be horrified, and I believe that they are. They don't even have the basic standards that we require of law enforcement, that we should wear body cameras, that we should also have judicial warrants, that you should at the very least take the mask off your face and be identified. These are very basic principles that all law enforcement have to abide by, but we have somehow allowed these goons to run across our country, these masked men who are killing people in broad daylight, and they are not required to even operate by basic standards. So we need to abolish the whole thing, really, until we get some standards in place. But it's very easy for my colleagues to say that, you know what, the American people, because we know they don't agree with this. They absolutely, this is not what anyone requested, that we have a country that we can't afford to live in, and now we have people who are unaccountable.
Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.
Thank you.
I do want to get you to some breaking news that we have been following throughout the morning. Take a look at your screen right here as President Trump says he is sending a, quote, massive armada to Iran. The announcement made this morning on Truth Social as tensions continue between the U.S. and Iran. Here is that full post right there on your screen. He says a massive armada is heading to Iran. It is moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose. It is a larger fleet headed by the great aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln than that sent to Venezuela. Like with Venezuela, it is ready, willing, and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. Hopefully, Iran will quickly, quote, come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons. One that is good for all parties. Time is running out. It is truly of the essence. As I told Iran once before, make a deal. They didn't. And there was Operation Midnight Hammer, a major destruction of Iran. The next attack will be far worse. Don't make that happen again. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Now, we do have this video that we've shown you coming in out of Iran within the last few weeks or so, and we know that activists are now saying Iran's crackdown on national protests have killed more than 6,100 people and many others still feared dead. The Iranian regime does argue that number is much lower. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier and guided missile destroyers accompanying it provide the U.S. that ability to strike Iran, as we've heard from Gulf Arab states that have essentially made it clear they want to stay out of any attack. Right now, I do want to discuss all of this further, so let's bring in Jonathan Sayeh, an Iran analyst with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Hi, Josh. It's great to be with you.
And first off, I wanted to ask you about this breaking news. You did see some of the comments there that were made by President Trump on Truth Social this morning about this armada. Kind of give me your take on all of that.
So comparing this scenario to Venezuela, what is a likely scenario is a situation where this fleet will be in place to block Iran's access to the oil market, illicit oil market at that, because under the maximum pressure campaign, this administration has sought to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero that is illegally getting transferred to China. That is one likely scenario, but another angle of looking at this is that this is a message to the Islamic Republic that, of course, we will advance and we will try our best to pursue diplomacy with you, but if that fails to materialize, we would have to pursue kinetic action against your whether military establishment or ballistic missile stockpiles. So it's really a message to the Islamic Republic, and the ball is in their court. It's debatable whether a regime like Tehran would actually negotiate in good faith, but nonetheless, all the options are now on the table when it comes to a potential deal or a strike against the Islamic Republic.
And is that what President Trump means, where he said in past days that all of this is kind of, quote unquote, in flux? Because we know that days ago we heard from President Trump, he said things had kind of moved downward as far as any plans for a U.S. military strike there. It seemed as though that was not really happening anymore. It was not on the table. But now you hear him say it's, quote unquote, in flux.
The angle to look at it is the first attack that may have been called off was likely a symbolic attack, and realistically it was going to be limited in its targeting. Now, with the reinforcements coming in, of course, the fleet and other elements in the region signals to us that if there were to be another attack, it would be larger in scale. So that's the real message there. But when it comes to diplomacy with the Islamic Republic, at this point, it is really challenging for us to really look at what leverage Tehran has, what cards they hold. After the 12-day war and after Operation Midnight Hammer, the Islamic Republic really lost its leverage because their nuclear program was targeted, their ballistic missiles were also targeted, even though they still continue to have the largest arsenal in the Middle East. Nonetheless, they don't really negotiate over ballistic missiles. They want to keep it contained to a nuclear deal, whereas Washington, on the other hand, has been pursuing something greater than simply limiting enrichment or really seeing another version of a JCPOA from 2015.
Has the Iranian regime overall been weakened, let's say weakened, by the U.S. actions there?
It certainly has been. So the way to look at it is that there's a domestic angle and an external angle. Domestically, we've seen the regime is inherently ideologically bankrupt. It's increasingly relying on foreign proxies to do its dirty work on its soil, which means that not only has it lost its legitimacy amongst its population, but also amongst its supporters. Externally speaking, the axis of resistance is severely weakened. Hezbollah does not have the same capabilities as it did a year ago. Same with Hamas and other entities as well. But more importantly, their air defenses are down and they have not been able to reestablish them. So really, their lines of deterrence are gradually decreasing. So it's really a prime opportunity for Washington and Europe and Israel in this case to leverage and capitalize on this anti-regime momentum because it's really a matter of time until we see another massive protest wave. Of course, the regime is going to continue to gun down these protesters, but nonetheless, that tells you that this regime is inherently illegitimate. It is the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and they actually sought to assassinate President Trump more than once.
And I have to imagine that it's not really a surprise that we're hearing these disputed casualty figures from the Iranian regime, because again, activists now saying that number is above 6,100 with more people feared dead. And essentially, the Iranian regime is saying, no, that's not possible. But that's not really a surprise to hear that number disputed, right?
It certainly is not. Unfortunately, Islamic Republic's diplomatic mouthpiece continues to spread lies. Evidently, they're not going to admit that they massacre their own people because, one, that would signal how illegitimate they are, but also it would really express that the regime has officially crossed President Trump's red line of murdering protesters. Listen, we heard numbers as high as 30,000, which is unfortunately believable given the weapons that was being used against protesters, given that they deployed over 5,000 terror proxies that are only trained in warfare against an unarmed population. And if you look at Iran, a country of 90 million with a lot of major cities, 14 million people just in the capital, the numbers start to make sense to you. If they were to kill a few hundred in each city, the numbers would increasingly go to tens of thousands. And they've done this before. This is not their first time that they opened fire on protesters. We know in 2019, they were able to kill 2,000 within about 24 hours. So now that this movement has gone on for 3 weeks, coupled with internet outages, tells us that realistically, the number is much higher than what we even hear from certain agencies or the Islamic Republic itself.
And as we kind of watch all of this play out, it's important to remember that a big aspect of this was the economy, right? And we've seen kind of a shift, I guess, in the currency there in Iran as far as what it's worth. Can you explain that for folks out there?
So Iran's protest movements have had different triggers throughout the past decade. This most recent one was an economic trigger. Nonetheless, the grievances were not limited to economic reform. When you look at the protest chants, no one is expecting improvement in the economy. All the demands from the protesters is regime change. That said, there are other triggers that have led to protest movements in Iran too, such as an environmental crisis, water scarcity that was unfortunately created by mismanagement and unstandardized dam constructions. You also have a surge in executions of political prisoners and just ordinary criminals. So if you look at all these angles, there's systemic issues that Iranians are suffering from, and they know certain policy change or reform is not going to change these issues, and they actually need to move away from this Islamic Republic. But more importantly, they know what they want to replace it with. So the calls for return of the Crown Prince Pahlavi, it tells us that the Iranian public, one, does not want this regime, and two, they have already chosen what they want as an alternative, which is what makes this wave really unprecedented compared to the past movements.
What do we need to be watching for? This is always my final question for you. In the coming hours, days, of course, we got this statement there from President Trump a bit earlier on today about this armada. So what should we be watching for in the coming hours and days?
The key thing here is whether Tehran would actually negotiate in good faith, or whether they're even willing to sit at a negotiation table. But more importantly, what are they going to negotiate over? Is it solely going to be the fate of a few kilos of enriched uranium, given that they don't even have the enrichment capacity? Given that after Midnight Hammer, the Islamic Republic's enrichment for the first time in the last 40 years was disrupted, and that was the main achievement of that attack. So in order to really build on that, it's very important that this administration knows its adversary is at its weakest. So that's one crucial thing to look out for. More air drills. I know CENTCOM has announced that they're doing exercises in the region. That is a signal. But more importantly, we have to also see whether the Iranian regime forces are going to adopt a defensive posture or not. And also any rhetoric coming from Israel, see what their stance is, whether they're going to engage the Islamic Republic militarily in cooperation with America. So there are a lot of moving factors. So the two things are any military movement or any diplomatic signs from the Islamic Republic.
Jonathan, thank you so much, as always, for helping to break it down. A lot of information here, so we definitely appreciate it. Anything you want to add, anything we missed before I let you go?
I would simply highlight that this movement, even though the protests have to an extent thinned out, to the average Iranian, this movement is not done. For things to go back to normal, given the scale of the repression, given the state of the economy, given the death count, it is very hard for us to imagine a day after scenario. So for them, there's no way out but through. And Iran has is the Middle East's biggest anti-Islamist movement, the most pro-American population. And really, it is now or never for Washington to be able to capitalize on this to ensure that it can have an ally in a very turbulent region.
All right. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you for having me.
In a social media post, Trump said a massive armada is heading to Iran. It is moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm and purpose. He says it is a larger fleet headed by the great aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln than that sent to Venezuela. Hopefully, he says Iran will quickly come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons, in all caps, as you can see, one that is good for all parties. Time, he says, is running out. It is truly of the essence. As I told Iran once before, make a deal. They didn't, and there was Operation Midnight Hammer, a major destruction of Iran. The next attack, he says, will be far worse. Well, earlier, Tehran denied President Trump's claims that it had requested negotiations with the United States. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said diplomacy cannot take place under military threat.
Our position is precisely that diplomacy exercised through military threats cannot be effective or constructive. If they want negotiations to take shape, they must abandon threats, excessive demands, and the raising of irrational issues. Negotiations have their own rules. They must be conducted on an equal footing, based on mutual respect and aimed at mutual interests.
Well, we have correspondents covering this story from the U.S. and Iran. First, we go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C. Kimberly, so a ratcheting up of the rhetoric there from President Trump.
Yeah, this is something that Donald Trump has said repeatedly in recent days. The threat of the Armada, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is now in the Middle East area in those waters. This is something that the U.S. president has tried to ratchet up in terms of pressure. And essentially what the U.S. president is saying with this latest threat is that Iran needs to agree to a deal to limit its nuclear program and to prevent the development specifically of nuclear weapons. So what we know is that the U.S. president is using past U.S. action against Iran as the leverage and the threat to get Iran to the negotiating table. He has also said repeatedly in recent days he believes Iran wants to make a deal, but he wants to see that deal made imminently, and that's why he is, in essence, turning the screws to put on the pressure.
All right. Ali Hashem in Tehran, how is this being viewed there, this new threat by the American president? How will the Iranians be receiving this?
Well, this threat comes as just a part of this sequence that's been going on over the past days. We've seen the military build up in the Arabian Sea, and of course, a lot going on behind closed doors. Mediators are trying their best to come out with a solution because the situation right now is really very serious. Now we're hearing from Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Gharib Abadi, saying that Iran's priority is not sitting with the United States, rather having a 200% readiness to face any attack. This is a few minutes ago. Also, we've heard of several phone calls today, and it seems a lot is going on the diplomatic side, a lot of attempts to try bridge the gap, which doesn't seem to be till the moment bridged. The Iranian foreign minister received calls from the foreign minister of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. These calls are all in this sequence. So what we're hearing from the Iranians, readiness to fight, and also readiness to talk whenever the negotiations are proper and they are not a kind of dictations on them.
Yeah, and Kimberly, as Ali mentioned there's a lot of diplomacy going on. Is there any indication in Washington that there is some talk happening behind the scenes to try and de-escalate the tensions?
We've known for some time that the Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, or at least his negotiating team, has been working with counterparts to try and de-escalate. Whether that is currently happening right now is not clear. What we also are unsure about is the exact terms of the deal that Donald Trump is looking for. There has been no text that's been released, but we do get an idea broadly of what the United States is looking for from Tehran, and specifically it's to end its nuclear ambitions, to stop it from enriching uranium to weapons grade. We know it's looking for robust verification in the form of inspections, and we also know that it's looking for a halting of its ballistic missile program, as well as an end to the support for its regional proxy forces. So the U.S. president has been relatively specific on what he's looking for broadly, but again, those very nitty-gritty details, those granular details, are still somewhat vague.
Ali Hashim, so we heard there what the U.S. might be looking for from Iran, from Kimberly, including the end of its nuclear ambitions. Is Tehran likely to make any concessions on any of those issues?
Well, the problem is that there are 4 issues that are on the table. The ballistic missiles issue, limiting the cap, putting a cap, and also limiting the size of the arsenal. On the other side, the nuclear issue and stopping enrichment towards 0%, which is in practice already happening because Iranians aren't enriching uranium anymore for now, since the U.S.-Israeli attack. Also, another main condition is that to curb Iran's regional influence and to stop posing threat to Israel. Now, when it comes to the ballistic and Israel, it's very complicated. The Iranians see the ballistic program as their only defense. This is how they are defending their country. This is what they've been saying, and this is what helped them during the last war. So giving up this program will leave them without the umbrella. For the nuclear, they're ready to talk, but they're not ready to give any kind of a concession that takes them towards a 0% enrichment. This is a red line, except if they decide to drink the poison chalice.
Ali Hashim in Tehran, Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for your reporting. We'll come back to you, of course, for all the latest developments on this story. Now, let's take a closer look at the U.S. military buildup in the Middle East right now. The Navy has deployed the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which is now in the Arabian Sea. The carrier operates up to 70 aircraft, including FA-18 fighter jets and surveillance planes. Its nuclear-powered system allows for long-term deployment without refueling, and it's accompanied by 3 guided missile destroyers capable of attacking targets far in.
Positive vibes. Downloading. You can say this system are really trafficking me. Brother man, we've been a try, we've been a fight every day, we've never surrendered. They're here with Christ. Them don't care if we die. You see them agenda. God protect me lives. See man them no faith in Christ. And them fail to guide them. They know the only we reside. Only but why not decide? But the world is their problem. We've been a try, we've been a fight every day. Never surrender. Them here with Christ. And them don't care if we die. You see them agenda. Lord protect me lives. See man them no faith in Christ. And them fail to guide them. They know the only we reside. Only but why not decide? The world is their problem.
love your song. That's not the first time this happened to me. Last time I played it, they was like, who is this? Like, you're awesome. You're gonna make it. You're a star. You are a star, okay? You're a star, okay?
Them here with Christ, and them don't care if we die. We see them agenda, Lord protect me nice. Man, them no friends with Christ, and devil to guide them. They know the bully we reside. Only for why no beside me, the world is their problem. Father, God, give your eyes for me life and me kids. Only you can hear me Christ, and you never deceive. We not perfect as human beings, we can be weakness. We always try to keep it clean and avoid the sickness. I true say many of them not real, but it's not the business. Fight is not the way to see it, man, we have it in less. So many you leave them on my yard, but them never come back. The family hope here, postcard, but them never get that. This is some plan we used to own, we go and sell it to them. The places that we used to farm them and the first wicked. Uncle Sam back them up cause he make him profit. And every time we try to stand up, take a head and we see. Grammar violence, one we street, but we still a resist. Only for man of God and preach, try to still a persist. Hey, Father God, only you can save me. Hey, hey, the system I really try to kill me. Hey, we been a try, we been a fight every day, we never surrender. Them here with Christ, but them don't care if we die. We see them agenda, Lord protect me lives. The man them not afraid for Christ, and devil to guide them. They know the bully we reside. Only for while no beside, but the world is their problem. Been a fight, been a fight every day, never surrender. Them here with Christ, but them don't care if we die. We see them agenda, Lord protect me lives. The man them not afraid for Christ, and devil to guide them. They know the bully we reside. Only for while no beside, but the world is their problem.
He's awesome, guys. Go download his song. I think he's so cool. Okay?